I've loved this campaign. Folks like George Monbiot have written about it in The Guardian. What is the Debt for Climate campaign, and what's the idea behind this?
Yes, thanks to both of you for having me. The campaign is basically an initiative from the Global South to have a say in the climate agenda of the Global North. I've been in Europe for 3 years. I come from Argentina, and I've been working with the climate movements here, and everything is so Eurocentric, and based on 1.5 degrees Celsius or the IPCC, or just reducing emissions without taking into account the colonialism that is behind the climate crisis and all the injustices that are truly leading to the climate crisis. So from the Global South, with the workers and indigenous people and social movements, we have been building this campaign that is demanding debt cancellation in order to be able to afford a just transition. Debt is a knee on the neck of the Global South that keeps our countries in perpetual expansion of the fossil fuel industry to keep extracting raw materials to ship to the Global North, just to be able to keep up paying the interest on these loans, not even the capital, because the interests are so huge that we are just struggling to keep up paying the interest on the loans. That's what is behind the climate crisis in the Global South, expanding the fossil fuel industry. And that's where the Global South is coming together to say, stop, enough. And we need to bring this to the table.
Absolutely. So it is essentially, hey, cancel this debt. We were talking about canceling debt. Cancel this debt, and we can actually better um, reroute or reconfigure our economies to be green. To and as I mean, let's just talk about some of that disparity as you're talking about the Eurocentrism of the climate discussion. What are those figures, or what is that the balance of how much a country like Pakistan, now facing insane flooding displacing millions of people, versus the United States or Western Europe are emitting? um you know there's This is not the same.
Yeah, right. Plus, Europe and the US, North America are by far the largest contributors of greenhouse gases, more than 80, 90%. The Global South accounts only for about 8%, and yet we are bearing most of the consequences. Most affected places of the world are in the Global South, like you just mentioned, Pakistan, most of Africa, most of Latin America. And what we need to do is have the Global North, first and foremost, recognize that they have a climate debt to the Global South. This climate debt is way bigger than our financial debt that we have to the Global North. The climate debt is not only based on the emissions, but also on 500 years of colonialism and enslavement of most of the world. It's really difficult to quantify. But if we want to take any steps toward reparations and loss and damage, and them recognizing and doing the right thing in the right direction, the first step has to be cancel the financial debts of the Global South, which you can do with a stroke of a pen if there is the political will to do that. And conversely, it's impossible for any country of the Global South to remotely even dream of having a just transition. All of these commitments of the Paris Agreement are bullshit.
Mm.
Nigeria's cost of servicing their debt 2 or 3 weeks ago has surpassed their national revenue. Okay? Most countries of the global south, for every dollar that comes in, you're paying 50, 80, 90 cents in terms of interest on the loans. Most of this debt is illegitimate to start with. It was awarded to dictators. It's a well known mechanism of colonialism called debt trap diplomacy. And I'm really glad to be on your show because the US has the largest power, wields the largest power behind this colonialism. The IMF, the World Bank are largely controlled by the G7, and the US has the largest voting power. I know it's a really difficult monster to move in the US when you have so many problems, but if we want to get serious about climate action, the first thing that needs to happen is to cancel the debt of the global south, to enable a just transition, and it won't just benefit the global south. We have trillions of dollars of fossil fuels in the ground.
Hmm.
And we also have trillions of dollars of debt to you, to the global north. If you could cancel that, you could enable the global south to actually leave trillions of dollars of fossil fuels in the ground, which would benefit all of humanity and could be the largest win, the largest victory in the climate movement until now.
I mean, I love this because we're starting to think about things like debt cancellation just in the wake of canceling $10,000 of student debt, something, here in the United States, unlike Argentina, where I did live for a while, college is way more expensive here and not necessarily better. But we're starting to see, well, what happens? This is money that is the federal government is the creditors. It's not going to cost us anything. We don't need to make this money back, just as we don't need to collect on the global south countries. It's just, we can just cancel it. It can be a wash, and we can lift that boot, as you're saying, from the necks of these countries that have so many other priorities, in the least of which is climate preparedness. Can I ask you about, do you think it matters to have like a stipulations? If there's debt cancellation, is it like, okay, then you can't develop this dam or this mine or whatnot? Or are you saying no blanket cancellation? Or are you saying something, the third thing you might be saying is, it like, inherently some of that debt is linked to these extractive projects anyway?
Yeah, and that is very well known. For example, there is something that is not addressed by anyone in the global north. That is the climate bombs that the global south has more than three or 400 of them. Argentina, one of them is Vaca Muerta.
Yeah.
It's about the size of Belgium and is the world's second largest shale gas basin and fourth largest shale oil basin, which they are destroying with fracking, like in the US. The US is building a military site on it because it's of so much geopolitical importance to the US to ensure accessibility to these resources in the long term. So this is a major carbon bomb of many carbon bombs that are not addressed by the Paris Agreement or any of the commitments the global north governments are making. The only way to ensure keeping these carbon bombs in the ground is debt cancellation and enabling a just transition. But the IMF, the World Bank are doing the exact opposite. The IMF lent my country, Argentina, a record loan, the largest loan in its history, in the IMF history worldwide, was awarded to President Macri, right-wing President Macri, a few years ago, deliberately to help him win the re-election, $44 billion under pressure from Trump to help his buddy. And luckily, he lost the re-election.
I
And
was gonna say, how
yeah,
did he do? Let's just, for the
uh,
record, I just want to hear it again. Macri se perdió. Sorry.
yes, yes, Macri lost. And since you live there, I'm sure you're up to date on all the
Fuck
news.
Macri. I left before he came to power, but fuck that guy.
Yeah,
Anyway,
but the problem is that the so-called progressive government that came after did not question the debt or call for an audit of the debt, which is actually can be proven to be illegitimate. The IMF broke its own statute to award it, and as soon as it came into the country, it flew out right back out through the financial scheme. So it didn't benefit anyone, as is usually the case. But the new government has legitimized this loan by getting it through Congress to borrow even more money just to pay the interest on the old debt. And what is well known is that the IMF gave this money to Argentina with the understanding that Vaca Muerta will be a major source of fossil fuels and revenue to be able to pay the interest on this loan. So these are the conditionalities that are forcing, and it's not just fossil fuels, but mining, mega mining,
yes.
lithium. It's just the old history of plundering the global south by keeping us in poverty, in a lot of debt, so that we have to plunder the resources and destroy the territories just to keep up paying, to keep floating above, just above water by paying this interest on the loan by never being able to pay the main capital.
And is that stipulated so like that loan is still tied to Vaca Muerta being developed?
No, it's not. It's not stipulating on a contract, but it's well described in a lot of media articles and stuff like that. But you asked me the opposite question: how will you stipulate that you will keep the fossil fuels in the ground when
I
you
did.
cancel the debt?
Yes.
And this is a very legitimate question. And the way we look at it is the other way around, from the bottom up. What we need to do is build power.
Mm,
And the climate movement until now in the global north is really naive. It's really a bubble where they don't have any contact with the working class. It's a big problem. In Europe, you have the rising cost of living. and the workers getting more and more antagonized from the climate activists as something as if climate activism
Right.
is a privilege of middle class white
Right.
people that have no other problems.
Right.
And I see a big danger in this as we are getting more and more fascist governments coming. Maybe we're one financial crisis away from fascism coming full force in Europe as well. And then the climate activists will be fully antagonized from the workers. So Debt for Climate is an attempt to build an alternative narrative of solidarity, international solidarity. When you talk to the workers of the Global South about debt, they get it. And Debt for Climate has built a bridge that enables the climate and the workers' movements to come together internationally,
Hmm.
together with the indigenous peoples that have been fighting this colonialism for 500 years. And that's how we've been able to mobilize thousands around the G7 a couple months ago in Argentina, in Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, global north, in Washington, D.C. We've been thousands, and for the first time, thousands of workers mobilized together with climate, thousands of climate activists and indigenous people. We're going to mobilize again during the annual meeting of the IMF and World Bank, which is from October 14th through 16th. And we're calling on everyone around the world to join us so that we can actually demand debt cancellation and enable just transition. And to answer fully your question, we first need to have the power on the streets. The movement that is necessary to get this debt cancellation is the same movement that will be vigilant so that the countries of the Global South don't get into debt again, and that the transition fully goes in the right direction instead of betraying what they say and getting back to expanding the fossil fuel industry. But that will be done by an actor in society that is not there yet, which is an actor of unified labor, climate, social, and indigenous movements that we have to build.
I love that. And I I do feel like you're picking up a piece that was left in the early 2000s. In the United States, I'm someone who became very active in the global justice movement, and the things that we were taking the streets for were against these IMF and World Bank policies that we knew were devastating countries abroad, but then also devastating the labor movement and workers in the United States. And so it was a climate labor unity, and then we got blindsided by the war on terror. You get Bush, you get all this. And of course, that's, again, paving the way for someone like a Donald Trump to come into power. But I feel like you're picking up on that thread that we had at some point. Movements in the global north kind of had, but lost it, and it's so important to link those fates. So I think it's such a powerful fucking powerful movement, powerful politics, and powerful framework. And it seems possible, right, Esteban? Because tell me, the proposals are also, I know from countries in the global south, like, well, why don't you guys just pay us to not cut down this rainforest, or pay us to keep it in the ground? And that's very not likely to happen, correct? I mean, that feels difficult, even though we absolutely should be paying a country like Brazil to like not cut down any more of the rainforest.
Yeah. There is a promise of paying the global south to help adapt to climate change in the Paris Agreement. $100 billion a year we're supposed to be given, but that's not even being fulfilled, even though it's a tiny amount of money compared to what is really needed. And even then, they want to do that as more loans, as more debt. So it's climate financing because they want to give you more debt. So together with that, there is historic demands for reparations, for loss and damage that go in parallel with what Therefore Climate is demanding, that
Yeah.
have to do with colonialism and slavery, that need to be paid back. But we know that the powerful will not give up power voluntarily. And if they really have to pay what they owe, they would all go bankrupt. Like just India, the case of India itself alone, in the 200 years or so of colonialism, India went from being one of the richest countries in the world to one of the poorest. England drained $45 trillion out of India. Imagine that if the UK had to give that back, and that's just one of their colonies, they would go bankrupt really quickly. So what we need to demand is, the first step is debt cancellation, because also if they give you financing or reparations or anything like that, the money that comes into the global south countries will be drained right away again through the debt payments that you have to make.
Right.
So unless you liberate first yourself from the debt burden, you will not be able to make any good out of any funding that they could throw at you as a little, like a breadcrumbs. That's what it really is.
I mean, that's what's so funny to me about this idea of even like asking for debt cancellation from the global north. It's like that is the very, very, very least that the global north owes the global south. And the framing of it is like, as if we are being so nice by canceling this debt. It's like, no, we fucking owe the global, like what you're talking about. We've the wealth of the United States and Europe is entirely built from the extracted primitive accumulation or whatever, just the taking of raw resources and all of these other things, and not just raw resources from colonized areas.
And continues to be, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's, I guess, my question for you, Esteban, in terms of, political shifts. I'm thinking in Latin America, like in neighboring Chile, right? Having Boric come in, or having Gustavo Petro in Colombia. We talked about that on this show, and them trying to turn away from this extractive model. Does that give you some hope in terms of these international alliances that can maybe push back on something like debt?
Well, yeah, the only way that we could have a chance at confronting this kind of power is uniting in blocks. So Latin America needs to unite in order to be able to confront the IMF, the World Bank, and financial colonialism, much like the Global South needs to unite, like Thomas Sankara called for from Burkina Faso, for a Global South front against debt, where many countries of the global south will come together to say no more to the global north. He was assassinated shortly after that. And this year is going to be the 35th anniversary of his assassination. And we're actually calling on this global action in his memory because it's October 15th, right in the middle of the IMF and World Bank meeting. So the same goes for Latin America. And Petro is ushering hopefully a new era for the Latin American progressives, because he's the first government that is actually promising to stop the extractive matrix of production and actually build a sustainable future for Colombia, and hopefully can lead the way for the rest of Latin America. We were really happily surprised because during his announcement speech, his inaugural speech, he actually called for debt for climate. He actually called for the IMF to cancel the debt of Colombia so that Colombia can take care of the Amazon. So we're really happy about that, and we hope that he continues to build on this demand and hopefully lead the way for other governments to follow that example.
Absolutely. And just someone who lived in Argentina for so long, the Macri loan was such bullshit, and like re-legitimized the IMF and the World Bank in a way that Argentina 20 years earlier had proven how bullshit these neoliberal, like, global financial loans were able to renegotiate their loan under the Kirchner administration, albeit not perfect. And the Kirchners, I don't think, are perfect at all. And I don't believe in the extractive soja model of soybeans, etc. But they proved that, like, all the IMF and the World Bank want to do is gut you for parts, and sell you for parts to abroad and loan you more and more and more and more. And then you have Macri coming in and just like another loan. It's just insane. It was insane to me to watch that happen. So I do have faith, though, that like places like Latin America and also India, places who've been screwed over a million times by these international institutions. Like, first of all, Esteban, the United States, we've got our own problems. You guys could never pay that back, and we would never, like, no one's invading. No one's invading. We're invading ourselves. We're doing coups on our own government.
Yeah, sadly, I think you're not far from that happening in the US, and I hope it doesn't. But yeah, I think the change has to come from the most affected people and areas. We've been silenced for too long. And I think changing the Eurocentric way of thinking of Europe and the global north is one important step in that direction, and beginning to recognize that the solutions to the crisis that was created from Europe and from the global north will not come from the same place that created the problem. And
Yeah.
that we need to do things differently if we want different results, like Einstein famously said. That's why the global south, we're building power from the bottom up, from the global south, and actually trying to make something disruptive. But we need the collaboration and solidarity of the movements in the center of power so that we can make the impact that we need.
Absolutely. Any final thoughts before we let you go? This has been so great.
No, thank you for letting us share this in your platform, reaching more people worldwide, but especially in the US, that is such an important place for the centers of power. If people are near Washington, D.C. or New York City, and they could mobilize or even start something from scratch, start your own Debt for Climate group, help us, spread the word and start really threatening the IMF, the World Bank, and the financial power that is behind the climate crisis, and that we can connect this way climate justice and social justice, because there is no climate justice without social justice, and there will be no victories without the workers leading the way in this fight.
Amen. Debtforclimate.org, at Debt for Climate on all the socials. Follow this work and follow Esteban at Esteban Servat, Servat, on Twitter. And thank you so much for taking the time. Thanks for breaking it down so effing clearly, and giving me some hope, honestly, because this is badass and I love it. What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/Bitchuation Room. Do it.